welcome to another edition of what podcast is this? Resisting Pretense. That'd be a great name for a podcast.
Resisting Pretense?
No, what podcast is this? I love it. We are here to have honest conversations about faith in modern culture, inspire maybe some faith-filled conversations in your life. Scott's going to turn his notifications off. Me too, actually. All right. And today our topic, well, thank you, as always, to our unofficial sponsor, Diet Coke, who showed up in large form today. If you watch this on YouTube, you will see the largest Diet Coke we have ever featured on our podcast.
Well, and I kind of figure this is to keep what we are promoting even greater the need for Diet Coke to sponsor us. And so since we're unofficial, we would love to see it become official with...
We have a full 2 liters of Diet Coke today on our podcast, which means we may have to pause for a potty break. All right.
It might make it through the podcast. We'll see.
We'll see. Today's topic, boundaries. I was waiting for like a response, and I got none. It felt
about
like
we're going to talk about.
I wish I could do that cricket sound. I knew a guy that could make that cricket, and it was so good. Yeah, you know him,
Gary East.
Gary Eastep. Yeah.
All names in this have been.
You know, if you need a good cricket sounder,
yeah, we will provide his email information.
Yeah, go to Phoenix and find Gary.
That's right. So we're talking about boundaries.
Boundaries.
Yeah.
And kind of the difference between boundaries and demands. Because I think those get a little conflated sometimes in our culture. People don't clearly define whether this is a boundary or a demand. And demands end up often in my head, they're part of the cancel culture part of our culture. They kind of head that direction often.
It's a little bit honestly subjective. Yeah. Because what I might sense as setting a boundary, you might be sensing or perceiving as a demand. Mm-hmm. And without a level of discussion about it, that may not resolve itself.
Yeah, I had a huge thing in my own life. I think the reason this came up, I'll get to my own life thing in a minute, but the reason this came up is I had a couple in our church that came to me seeking counsel because there was a lot of tension between the parent and grandparents in this family, and parents having one standard for the kids, grandparents having another standard for the kids, and there was this clear need to establish some boundaries. And it's not going to be an easy situation for them. It's going to be hard. They've gone for a very long time really without articulating boundaries, and so putting them into place, it's going to be a painful process, I think. And so it made me think back again to my experience, that I think the time in my life where I learned the most about boundaries is we had an adult daughter that at 18 left our home under not the greatest of circumstances. Was very unhappy with us, and then would occasionally kind of reach out to us. And we had set some boundaries because we had a toddler in the house that I think we felt like we needed to protect from the emotional upheaval of our relationship with our daughter. And so we said, here's our boundaries. These are the things that we are looking for in order to engage with you. And it's your choice whether you choose to do them or not. And we understand that. Like we're not forcing you to, but if you're not willing, like for example, to to be in counseling. We're not confident we could have a healthy relationship, and so we'll just pass until that time. And oh my goodness, did we get a very strong, angry response, because from her point of view, it was a demand.
Mm-hmm.
From our point of view, it was just about, like, we had no way to enforce that demand, and we, but it was kind of our criteria for the conditions in which we would engage in the relationship, and that was not particularly well received.
It's interesting because I was actually reading an article this morning and feel comfortable commenting on it because it was obviously a public forum. But this young man, his mom had come and was going to help his sister with a pregnancy. But there's not enough room for the mom to stay with the sister, so she was going to stay with her son, the brother, mm-hmm. because he had room. And the son was like, "Yeah, you can stay, no problem, not a big deal." And so the first morning, he wakes up and his mom makes this big breakfast, and this guy says, I generally don't eat except for one meal a day, and that's in the evening. I usually have a coffee in the morning and then maybe some fruit at lunch, and then my main meal is in the evening. And so I said, "Mom, you don't need to make me breakfast. This is not my routine. Please stop. But, you don't need to do that." Next day, she makes breakfast. And she's using his food to do this. Mm. And so he's like, "Mom, please do not make me breakfast." Well, this goes on for like 3 or 4 days that he keeps saying, "Do not make me breakfast. Mm-hmm. Stop using my food to make me breakfast. I don't eat breakfast." And finally he got to the point where he said, "You have to leave because you are not respecting the boundary I have set." Mm-hmm. Then you need to leave. And so she went, I think the mom went to the sisters or something like that. But then they asked him, "She can't stay here. There's not enough room. Can she come back to your house?" And he said, "Yeah, she buys her own food. I'll give her room in the freezer and the fridge. She buys her own food, and she does not do anything for me because she obviously can't respect the boundaries I have set." And it's like the whole family was going, "Oh, and one of the issues, honestly, the son said, he says, "I hate wasting food. It is a pet peeve of mine. Mm-hmm. So when I don't eat this breakfast, she just throws it down the disposal or in the trash, and I have a problem with that." And so, he set very clear boundaries, but
and she wouldn't honor them.
And yeah, because I think she saw them as demands and disrespectful. Because she's the mom. And it's like, and I think it is hard to set boundaries when we're talking about family. And yet that's the one we most likely are going to have to set boundaries with.
Right. Yeah. And it's interesting when we set boundaries with our daughter, the situation I shared, got a lot of, we didn't just get negative reaction from the daughter. We got negative reaction from extended family members who thought we were just being cruel.
Yeah.
And didn't really want to engage in a conversation, just kind of looked at us with a certain amount of disdain. And we knew why we were setting those boundaries, and I'm comfortable with the boundaries that we set. And even at one point later on, in a telephone conversation, even my daughter said, "You were right. Like, there would have been this on again, off again, on again, off again thing, and that would have been unfair to to my son, her brother." But that was the one time she acknowledged that.
Well, and it's interesting because I was thinking about this in your situation. there's that old adage which is, in my opinion, basically a lie, but time heals all wounds. Well, time heals all wounds doesn't heal all wounds if you continue to run over the boundaries. And so, sometimes you have to make sure the boundaries, you can set them from now, but you got to make sure that they're in place in the future until whatever the situation is resolved to the satisfaction of both parties.
Yeah.
Or all parties, I should say.
So there's a really fuzzy line, I think, between boundaries and demands, because particularly it's easy when you set a boundaries for these are the things I'll watch, these are the things I'll do and not do. Like those are about me and what I'll do. And generally, the prevailing definition of boundaries and versus demands, as I understand it, is like a boundary is the definition of what you will and won't do, but a demand is what you are requiring of someone else. But sometimes, like in the situation with my daughter, I didn't require her to go to counseling, but the boundary was if she wasn't in counseling, I didn't have any confidence we could have a healthy relationship. So I would not engage in the relationship. And that is a hair's breadth from a demand, to be. I mean, but it's also, there was no animosity or judgment on my part. Like she had the choice to do counseling or not. And I will respect her choice to do counseling or not. I just have a boundary that without her in that situation, I'm not going to engage. And that's a very fine line. And most of our relationship boundaries they have an element of an expectation or, in the parent-grandparent situation that I was talking about, there's an expectation of the parents for example, don't want to bribe the kids with food. Like they don't like to use food as a punishment or reward. They're like, hey, if you want to give them candy, just give them candy because you love them, but don't do it as a punishment or reward. They don't. That's just something that's important to them, and the grandparents don't get it, and so they want to and there's that thing, and so there is this it's the parents setting a boundary over how their children, and it is a demand on the grandparents. But what it ultimately becomes is the parents' boundary for, under these conditions, I'm happy for you to spend time with your grandkids. But care of those kids is ultimately the parents' responsibility. And so they're setting a boundary for that. But so the distinction between boundary and demand gets a little fuzzy, don't you think?
I do. And I was trying to walk my way through it a little bit, because the sense that boundary inherently feels like you have a choice. If you want to be in this relationship, here are the boundaries. If you don't want to be in the relationship, then don't be in the relationship. But and that's your choice. Or, if you choose not to respect these boundaries that I've set, then we can't have a relationship. Where demand doesn't really give you the choice. You will behave this way, and in some ways I was thinking, about it. So is Sam's Club card a boundary? I mean, honestly, when you think about it,
kind of.
If I'm going to have a relationship with him, I have to have a card.
Yeah.
But I don't have to. I can choose not to have that, And so, and that's a very simplistic view of it. But I think you're right. And I think that sometimes we set demands, and I think our culture sets demands instead of boundaries. And it expresses itself oftentimes in a lot of the controversy we see in community.
Yeah, I think one of the great examples is our weird situation these days with pronouns. I almost got Scott to cough up his Diet Coke. Um, Speaking of, I could use some more of that. And so it's one thing for someone to tell me, you know what, I prefer for you to call me these pronouns, or even to say, like, these are the pronouns I use. If you're willing to use them, I'm like happy to engage in conversation with you. And if you're not, then I just prefer not to have a conversation with you. That that feels like a boundary. But an angry, like, you have to call me by this pronoun, like that I am obligated because you want me to speak a certain way, that's a demand. Now, if it's a request or even just a boundary of, like, these are the conditions that I'll engage. But it's I guess for me, a lot of times the demand carries an emotional component that's like trying to it's forceful.
Mm-hmm.
It's trying to force someone to do something, and if they won't do it, there's usually an angry response. Whereas a boundary to me ought to be just a very cut and dry thing. Like, here's the conditions to play in this field. Here's the card to shop in this store. And if you don't have the card, you don't shop in this store. And if you do have the card, you shop in this store. And it's simple. And it doesn't necessarily have to be charged with a lot of emotion. And when it is charged with a lot of emotion, it often feels to me like it's moving toward a demand.
When we deal with boundaries every day of our lives, I mean, it's not like when I walked into my marriage, when I made those marriage vows, I was setting boundaries as to how I would behave within that relationship.
Mm-hmm.
When I break those vows, that's when it can quickly move from that unemotional boundary to a very emotional boundary. Mm-hmm. You said you would, and now you're not. So I'm calling you on that boundary. And we don't like to be called on the boundary, but sometimes that can feel like a demand,
Yeah, we have a word for demands in our culture now that's kind of funny. We call it Karen. But that's in a lot of ways, that's an example of the demanding part of our culture. When you see someone who's like screaming it in someone's face, like, literally demanding their way, that's not a boundaries issue. That's somebody who's clearly just.
I'm sorry, that's a mental health issue.
But I think we have to acknowledge that we sometimes do the same thing, like where we could have boundaries with our faith, sometimes we make them demands. Mm-hmm. And like I was thinking about people who are very kind of demanding that, like, don't swear in front of me.
Mm.
And that's it can be a boundary. You could express it as a boundary, like, hey, I'm kind of uncomfortable with that language. If you can dial it back, we can continue the conversation. But if that's not an option, I think I'll just pass on the conversation. That to me is kind of boundary like, but a lot of times it's just like, don't swear in front of me. That's wrong. Blah, blah, and you are demanding that they live by your standard.
Well, and oftentimes that comes across as not just don't swear in front of me, but you're a bad person for swearing to begin with.
It's a judgment.
And so you need to stop swearing, and that's a demand.
Mm-hmm.
I'm demanding something of your life when in reality it should be, I'm uncomfortable with this. So, if you don't mind, would you mind not swearing around me? And if not, then we can end the conversation. I'm okay with that.
Yeah, and maybe an even better example is I hear this from time to time. I don't hear it as much now as I used to, But I hear people, I heard it last week, or somebody.
But it's not happening very often.
Yeah, I don't hear it a lot still, but I did hear it last week. Somebody complaining about how we took prayer out of schools. And we should have prayer in school. And that almost always means to the people I hear saying it, who are usually Christian people, they mean we should have people praying, people leading the entire school to a prayer, a Christian-oriented prayer. And I find that a little like not anywhere near a boundary. That's a demand that everyone else does what we want them to do, whether they believe in it or not. And I have my own convictions about prayer in school. I don't think prayer ever left school. As long as there are tests, there will be prayer in schools. I'm not kidding. And so publicly led prayer in a country with freedom of religion, like I don't necessarily want my son being led in a Hindu prayer or a Baha'i prayer or a Mormon prayer or whatever. So why should I, if I'm going to love my neighbor as I love myself, like why would I want, why would I expect an atheist kid to have to be forced into a situation where they're in Christian prayer? So it seems like kids never lost the freedom to pray in school.
Well, and I think that's, when you were talking about it, I thought, I've heard the argument, we took Christ out of the schools when we took prayer out of the schools. And I'm thinking, no, because there's lots of kids who are Christians going to school, and they are representing and sharing the light of Christ in their school. And so just because it's not a formal process doesn't mean that Christ isn't involved. And if you're concerned about prayer in schools, my question would be, are you praying for schools? Are you, you want to complain about it, but are you actually praying for our schools? Because I think that's just as impactful as actually saying we have to have prayer or don't have to have prayer.
Well, and let me add another thought. I'm sorry, I kind of interrupted you, but it felt like you were going to turn a corner, and I didn't want to lose this one. The way Jesus talks about prayer was the last thing Jesus would want you to use prayer for is a public demonstration of faith. And so it seems like this demand for prayer in school is like almost exactly the opposite of how Jesus talks about prayer.
So is there a time for demands versus a time for boundaries? So let me give you my example. Is standing for the national anthem with your hand over your heart, is that a demand or is that a boundary?
What do you mean about it?
This pause is...
Well, I'm trying to, because I have a funny thing about the national anthem. But, do you mean the expectation that everyone will do that?
Yeah.
It seems kind of like a demand, really. They all want you to do it, but there's no boundary to it. It's like, if you don't do it, you're not going to get kicked out of you're not going to get kicked out of the high school football game if you don't stand for the national anthem.
I don't know. In this culture, you might get canceled. I don't know. But the thing about that is, and I somewhat joke about that, but you watch in professional sports, and if somebody takes a knee in protest, they are either highly supported or highly chastised for that action. But the action is believed in protest that we are expected to stand for the national anthem. And by kneeling, I am protesting something about whatever they're protesting that week. So, so but it is, so I'm like you, I'm thinking, well, it's kind of an expectation and demand of
generally of culture, like
of the cultural respect of it.
Yeah.
But I hadn't thought about it until you started talking about prayer in school. That's like, that's an interesting twist on that. Anyway, I digress.
Yeah, and I think sometimes like Christians get all up in arms when we hear people who want to take under God out of the Pledge of Allegiance, and they demand that we keep that in. And again, it's kind of like you can set your own boundary. If they take under God out of the Pledge of Allegiance, you could just always say it. And
or not say it if you don't want to.
Yeah.
The choice is there.
Yeah. We had, and then I had a thought. You and I in prep for this episode talked about like Christians that were boycotting Starbucks because of their Christmas cup.
Yeah, because they took Merry Christmas off and just went to a red cup.
Yeah.
And was like.
And then we talked about Christians that are boycotting Disney and or Target because of their policies or whatever. And I thought, is that a demand or a boundary? It's actually kind of a boycott by its nature is kind of a boundary.
Well, yeah, I think so, because you are making the choice to say, because you support this, I'm not going to shop. I will choose not to shop at your store.
Yeah. I think what becomes the demand is the interesting thing, is when Christians demand that every other Christian set the same boundary they're setting.
Correct.
And that's where then I'm like, come on, like if that's your boundary you want to set, like I'm not going to support this business or that business or that business. That's fine. That's your boundary. But when you make it almost like a condition of real faith that you have to hold these same convictions that I have, then I'm like, that's really now just a demand that you have of every other Christian to be just like you.
I don't fault Christians who say, I am not going to support certain businesses because of something. But I agree with you when they demand you to do it, because that's their belief, because that's their conviction. I struggle with that a little bit because, pardon me, and this goes back way back, but in fact, before I moved to Yuma some 24 years ago, it was even before that, there was a big controversy because AT&T was supporting a gay march or something like that. And everybody said, boycott AT&T. Mm. You know, especially the Christian coalition or whatever was saying, boycott AT&T. And my emotional first thought was to get on board with that. But then I really began thinking about it. And I thought, if I boycott them because of who they support, then how many other businesses that I enjoy their product would I have to boycott or stop using because they are connected to some business that's connected to some business that's connected to something I disagree with?
Yeah, where do you draw the line?
And it's funny as Christians because we get upset because one business will support something we don't like, but then we get mad when somebody boycotts a business we do like. So, you know, if it's a Chick-fil-A or a, what's the craft store?
Hobby Lobby.
Hobby Lobby. They get all up in arms when people are boycotting them because they're supporting Christian values. Well, if you like the store, go buy from them. If you like their ethics, go buy from them. If you don't. That's the boundary. But to demand other people to do it because that's your passion, that's a demand. So to demand you make the same choice I do is it crosses that line from boundary to demand.
Yeah. And yeah, I struggle with boycotts in general, and this is a little off topic, but I just if we take that tendency to say, like, I don't agree with this business's values, so I won't shop there. I don't. Then where do you, like, which values do you apply that to? Like, if a business is very greedy, is that also a reason to boycott? Is it just over things like, you know, um, you know, same-sex relationships or marriage or transgender issues, how they do their bathrooms? What, these are hot topic stuff. You know, are those the only issues that, and those tend to be kind of a lot of times the issues that people want to boycott over? But what about a corporation that's like super greedy, um, like, or that treats their employees poorly? Like, are we sensitive to that? Does that matter or not? And there's a point where if the only businesses we will ever support or or frequent are ones that are owned and operated by Christian people, are we really honoring the intent that God sent us to be salt and light in the world and to be in the world, just not of the world? Like, there's a lot of challenging dynamics to a boycott culture, which kind of is, in a lot of ways, that's not that different than cancel culture. And I don't really know anybody that's super excited about cancel culture.
I don't either. And I am not, if I were to be fully transparent, I am not a fan of Target, mainly because I felt like when they decided not to allow Salvation Army to do their buckets in front.
Which is weird because red.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think they looked at Salvation Army as being this Christian organization, and I'm looking at it going, do you realize how much that organization helps the poor?
Right.
That helps the needy. They didn't ask you to do anything except allow them to stand in the front. And so when that happened, I really struggled with that, and so, but that's my personal preference to say, I wouldn't say to somebody else, don't go to Target because they da-da-da-da-da. I would say, I don't go to Target for this reason.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't blame anybody who does. I have lots of Christian friends who like Target and who enjoy shopping there. And I'm like, you go, man, have a good time.
I like their sense of design. Target has style. I don't shop there a lot because generally the same thing at Walmart is 3 cents cheaper. So I'm saving a lot of money. But I do like Target's sense of design.
And I don't think there's anything, there's nothing inherently wrong with them. It's just, and they did make a change a few years ago, not several years ago, not a political change or religious change. They just changed some of the way they lay out their store and that kind of thing that I just like, no, this isn't for me anymore. So but again, that's my choice.
Right.
That's the boundary I set, and I go, that's something that is personal to me. And I'm pretty sure that Target hasn't lost one stockholder because I dropped out.
No,
so
they've probably lost 3 cents
from you.
No, from me.
How do we and I know we're a little off our topic here, but my question is, how do we engage in that kind of conversation in our culture? If our podcast is really about how to engage culture, how do we engage culture in a conversation about demands versus boundaries, or how? Because I think that we. Man, I'm stumbling all over my words. Must have been something in the Diet Coke.
That's right. There's too much of it.
I got the jitters now.
Well, I think I have an answer. I think I know where you're going.
Okay, well, ask the question then, because I don't think our audience will know what my question was.
How do we choose boundaries over demands?
Well, not only how do we choose that, but how do we engage culture in a conversation about that?
Well, I think it starts with a little self-analysis, the humility and the honesty to say, oh, I have this issue, like, and in many ways, like what you've said about you and Target. I have this discomfort with a decision Target makes. I'm not going to choose to go there, but I'm also not going to be a Karen about it and try to. Sorry, I'm probably going to get in trouble for that. We lost
all names
our
represented
listener.
on this. That's 50%.
But I'm also not demanding that everybody jump on my bandwagon and we're going to try to end this company, that kind of thing. And being honest about, what if this is something that's just my personal conviction, or whether I'm trying to demand people to live by my standard. That's I think a big part of it. And then I think one of the great ways that we can engage in conversation about this is when we set our boundaries. If we can take the emotion out of it, then we can have a conversation. It's when we live in this state of perpetual offense that it shuts down. It's uncomfortable to have a conversation with someone who's just like deeply offended all the time, and you feel like you're walking on eggshells. And we can choose to not be that person. Like, I can have a conversation with someone who has different convictions. Like I had a phone conversation with a lady the other day that is interested in our church, is in a lesbian relationship, and wanted to know how they would be treated at Stone Ridge. And I could have tried to use that opportunity to force a conversation about, my perspective on their relationship. So I don't think that's God's intent for us. But instead, I just had a really honest conversation and said, well, you and I probably have different convictions about whether or not that's what God intended for our relationships. But I can tell you that I would still aspire to treat you with kindness and respect. And we've had people attend our church before that had different convictions, but you would, like, I was honest and said you'd be very much in the minority at Stone Ridge. But my aspiration would be that you would at the very least be treated kindly and loved for who you are, even if our conviction around here is that that's not God, what God intended for relationships. And we were able to have a good conversation. It didn't descend into a shouting match or an unhealthy argument. And I think when we're able to kind of like talk about our boundaries without making them highly emotionally charged, that's what allows conversation to happen. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I think there's a lot of truth to what you just said. I was pondering as you were talking, so it makes it sound like I wasn't listening to you, and I was. But I was thinking about that. God has set boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
But God has always set boundaries for us to have a healthy life. We've oftentimes had conversations with people that said, if you're a Christian, what if you're wrong? What if everything you believe in is you're wrong about? And the answer is, well, even if I'm wrong, I believe that the things that were laid out for me cause me to lead a healthier life than if I didn't have them.
Hmm.
If I'm right, then that changes the whole narrative.
Right.
So I believe that God has set boundaries because they're healthy for us, because they give us life, and the things that we do to step outside of those boundaries steal life. And you know, whether we're talking about, you know, I believe that God has set a boundary for good communication, and that we should have good communication. But communication taken beyond God's boundaries can become gossip, and that's life stealing, not life giving. You know, a sexual life is a boundary. God gave us the gift of a sexual life within the boundary of a marriage between a man and a woman. Anything taken outside of that is unhealthy to either to the relationship or to the community or to the culture. So I think that what I would hope would be is that in some of those conversations, the question might be about, is the boundary even healthy? Is it even, you know, is it something you're engaging in out? And it goes back to what you said about self-reflection. Is this something that I just want? Or is this something set within the boundary of what God wants? And oftentimes the boundaries that we, let me rephrase that. Many times when I get in trouble, it's because I'm trying to go against a boundary that God has set. And so there is this tension that is created. And I think that's sometimes what happens is that we're trying to set healthy boundaries, but it creates a tension because we haven't done that self-analysis. What is my reasoning for my boundary? And once I set that, then how do I have the conversation? How do I step into that? So I don't know if that answers your question or not.
No, I think so. You know, there's a difference between being uncomfortable in a conversation and being offended.
Oh, great point.
And I think we often take conversations where we might be uncomfortable, and then we interpret that as offense, and then it charges the conversation. But it's okay to be uncomfortable as we talk to somebody that has different values and perspectives and convictions that we have. It doesn't mean we always have to be offended, because just that they have different values. And when we can acknowledge the discomfort, we can have a conversation. When we kind of indulge being offended, it usually shuts down conversation. So I think that's important for us is try to be, you know, as the Bible says, like slow to anger. That offense, like if you're hard to offend, you will find yourself able to have more really faith-infused conversations about even sometimes difficult topics. So.
Well, and I think it's interesting because my wife and I have a boundary in our relationship that basically says when I begin to feel defensive or offended, I have permission to stop the conversation and take a moment to reset. And then be able to come back into the conversation. And I think it's a tactic that I think we could use a whole lot more in society, instead of getting to that so offended that now I'm hurt, I'm damaged, I'm full of hate or whatever that might be.
Right.
You know, where in those conversations, you know, especially when we know they're going to be emotionally charged, is to be able to say, can we agree that when we reach certain points, we both are willing to say, stop, time out, give me a minute to reset, and let's continue the conversation. I think that's healthier than just going to the point where you're just so offended that you're
just going to try to hurt him back.
Yeah. And where,
or give him a piece of your mind.
Where there's more destruction than there is understanding and production and learning and those kinds of things.
Yeah. All right. I think we said what we can say about that one.
It's a great conversation, though.
Yeah, I like it. And I think really evaluating what should I and shouldn't I take offense at, and even if I even if I am offended, what is the best response to offensive things in our lives, and what's the response to offense that would most honor Christ? And that's a whole nother podcast.
Oh, yeah, it is. Yeah, it is. You know, so I don't know if you're setting a boundary on our time or a demand on our time. But I would, to our listeners, I oftentimes talk to you in different aspects, and many of you say how much you enjoy the podcast, and very grateful for your response, very grateful for your feedback. Would love it if you would share the podcast with your friends. Would love to hear more people coming back. And if you have a suggestion for a podcast, we got a great suggestion a couple weeks ago that we are working on putting together. And so if you have a suggestion, you can email me, scott@stoneridgechurch.com, or tom at stoneridgechurch.com. We would love to hear your suggestions for a podcast that you would like to hear us or a guest discuss. So just want to throw that out there as well.
Yeah. Go out and have those faith-infused conversations.
Have a great day.